This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, the world's leading international professional body which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. My name is Maxine Bell, and I am delighted to introduce you to a new series, A Day in the Life of. These podcast episodes will be released between our longer themed podcast series that you are already used to. We've been interviewing coaches for a while now under the theme A Day in the Life of for our LinkedIn newsletter, and they were so well received we wanted to offer them to a broader audience. The interviews are with real, everyday coaches across the globe from all walks of life who join me to honestly and bravely share their journeys into coaching, how they coach and run their business, what they love and what their challenges are, as well as how they integrate self-care into their practice. It's a real honour to get a sneak peek into their lives, and we hope that listening to their stories will inspire, encourage and assist you, whatever stage of your coaching journey you are on. Hello and welcome back to our Day in the Life series. And with me today, I'm very happy to welcome Conny Weyrich. Welcome, Conny.
Thanks, Maxine. Thank you so much for having me and inviting me into this conversation.
Oh, you're very welcome, and really interested to hear what type of coach you are. So should we just start with that? Just give a sort of overview to our listeners of what type of coaching you do, what your coaching practice looks like.
Yes, sure. So I'm an arts-based and trauma-informed coach. I am based in Australia, Melbourne, Australia, or specifically an hour outside of Australia. And I work and live on the unceded lands of the Judja Wurrung people. And at this point, want to pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. So my coaching in my private practice sense-making space is arts-based and trauma-informed. They're two key pillars of my work. But like so many people, I've not come straight into coaching after university. So I've also got 20 years of working in the corporate sector in different marketing and strategic roles in consultancy. And I hold a master's in therapeutic arts practice, which really informs that arts-based and trauma-informed way of how I approach my coaching. I work mainly online. So I initially started out as a more conventional art therapist, if you like, working a lot face-to-face with people in a studio space. And then the pandemic hit, of course, and forced me to quite quickly reinvent and reconsider. And I have shifted from art therapy more into this arts-based coaching space, which I now deliver online, working with people in one-on-one settings, but also with groups, online programs, workshops, with people from all over the world, which is really rewarding, fascinating, full of variety, and has brought creativity into my life in a way I didn't know it when I was in the corporate sector.
That's quite a background, Conny. So you were in corporate and you were doing marketing type things. What happened to make you go towards firstly art therapy and then turning that into coaching?
I've always dabbled with a more creative career, even when I finished school and before going to university. But for circumstances and different influences and people who shaped me, I've chosen a more traditional career in business, something that felt a bit safer, if you like. Then I hit my middle years, sort of around the 45-year age mark, and I was already here in Australia. And I just got to that point where I started wondering whether work could be something else. So I started thinking about the role of work in my life in general, the impact the work had on my body, my health, my relationships. So I've spent 20 years in open plan offices, being probably incredibly unsuited to that environment and finding it really just challenging on my energy levels to work in those spaces. There were a lot of aspects I really enjoyed about consultancy work, but there was just simmering in me, this wondering, what else could work be? And that made me go back to studying. So I went back to university to do a master's in therapeutic arts practice. And that arrived in me just like a lightning bolt, where I literally thought, is there something like art therapy? I didn't even know that existed. And I researched it and I thought, that would be working with people, working creatively. It just piqued my interest. And I enjoyed going back to learning and to studying and into an environment where I could express myself very differently. So there was a lot more variety in the people I interacted with. I think it opened up something different for me, seeing myself in a different light. I never imagined running a business. I didn't have myself down as someone who would run a small business. It wasn't something that influenced me growing up, but it just opened up all these possibilities.
Yeah, so it must have been quite a shift from one world into another, but it sounds like a really good one for you. Does that mean you now feel that you work more authentically as yourself?
I would say so, yes. I've now created work for myself that feels more aligned with my values. So I think one big challenge was in the corporate setting. I did a lot of consultancy work for brands. I worked a lot in sort of advertising. Is there was work for a lot of products which didn't align with my personal values. So they didn't necessarily align with my thoughts around sustainability or how I wanted to be in the world, the footprint I wanted to leave from an environmental perspective, the continuous growth model that the economy is still subscribing to. I found that more difficult. And I think working in that coaching space has allowed me to create something that feels aligned with my values, where I can bring my full self to the table. I think in the corporate space, I often had a sense I needed to leave part of me outside the room a little bit. And now I feel that all parts of me can actually come to the table with their individual strengths and ways of being and ways of working.
So why have you moved into coaching rather than stay as an art therapist?
It's a really good question. I think initially during the pandemic, as I switched to online, working in that conventional therapeutic way, and I had worked with individuals with quite complex trauma backgrounds, that felt to be delivered online for me at that point in my career like a step too far. And I just felt I needed to be more experienced to really hold those complex relationships and complex experiences in an online space. So I simply in 2020 stepped back a little bit from them. And as I started just experimenting, as many of us did during the pandemic, in terms of how else can I use my skills and my experiences, I started experimenting. I sort of nudged towards that coaching space. And I realized that a lot of the clients I worked with, that they found coaching as a concept more accessible. They would have never Googled, I want to find an art therapist to work with, but they would Google, I want to look for a coach. And they were open and curious about arts-based coaching. So for me, it was almost more of a shift of how I spoke about my work rather than working completely differently in terms of how I showed up in my sessions.
So we're just going to talk about two aspects of your work. Let's start with the art-based thing.
Yeah.
As you know, I'm passionate about using creative techniques with coaching or even in art therapy. Actually, I've had art therapy as well, and I know how powerful it is. And we did a whole podcast series, as you know, talked to a lot of coaches who use different creative techniques. Could you want to explain to listeners what it is you find that's so good about using an art-based approach with coaching?
Yeah, working creatively or arts-based, it's another way of expression, self-expression. And what it allows us to do is express something or explore something that we might not quite have words for or language for. So that is one real benefit, that when I work with clients who have a sense of maybe a vagueness about what's not working or a stuckness that's showing up, sometimes working through our thinking brain, the executive brain, and putting it into language is actually really difficult because we're experiencing something we really haven't quite found the words for yet. Or we might drop back into very well-rehearsed familiar narratives and stories that we've told ourselves time and time again. They're the stories we know, and we don't even realize that beneath the surface there's another story waiting for us. So I think that is one aspect I really enjoy. And we know that working creatively also taps more into our limbic system, so the area of the brain where emotions live. And I think that's important. And then I think also simply the engaging with materials and the process of making something can be really insightful. So it's not about what I put on the page if I use painting or drawing, for example, and then I look at the outcome and find ways of interpreting or find a message in that as a client. But it's about using the process and the qualities of materials that is sometimes really insightful and gives us a different idea about something or a different insight into our experience.
Yeah, it does. And for anyone that hasn't tried it, I would recommend trying at least one art-based coaching session. You get really surprised at what pops up and what comes out of that unconscious or that place where you're not trying to control, because we control our minds a lot, don't we, every day? So, and getting into those hidden places, it's very powerful and it's very quick. And you do need some guidance and training to hold a space with art-based coaching. It's not something to dive into lightly, is it really?
It can go very deep. And I think that's what surprises people sometimes. I think there's a tendency to think about arts-based work as, oh, that's nice, that's lovely. We work with imagery. When I was back working in clinical settings, more as an art therapist, psychiatrists would often refer clients who were creative. So as soon as they ascertained, oh, that person knits or draws, oh, go to art therapy. But actually working in an arts-based way, whether that's therapeutically or in coaching, it can go very deep very quickly. That means that the coach has to have the right skill set and experience and qualification to hold that deep process. And the client also needs to be at a point where they can hold that. So where they are well resourced and regulated well enough to be able to hold such a deep process. And sometimes clients are just really surprised by doing a fairly straightforward process that it stirs up something that's really emotional. And they say, oh, I didn't see that coming, but here it is.
Yeah, absolutely. It can be just a simple thing of, I know I got asked to draw a certain shape once, and it triggered something quite traumatic, actually, to my surprise. So it is very powerful and deep. The Association for Coaching, as you know, earlier this year did a creative coaching festival. So anyone who's interested in finding out more, that is online on the Association for Coaching website, and you can access the whole festival. But also what we did, and what I might add to the show notes, Connie, is we created an ethics guide, didn't we? Well, it was actually Beth, Claire McManus and Sally Walters and some others who created an ethics guide for coaches. And actually I can put that PDF onto our show notes, and that will, I think, be quite useful. It's just an introduction to those things that you've just mentioned and the responsibility and care that you have to take care of your clients and yourself, really.
Something else just came to mind when we work with imagery, and it links into another quality that I bring to my coaching, working in a trauma-informed way. So images, and maybe in a way, as you said, that shape you were invited to draw brought up something quite deep and traumatic for you. When we work with images, we need to realize that people who've experienced trauma, they might see these images differently. So these images go straight, and also really fast, like on a superhighway, to a certain memory or emotion, and often an embodied memory. And in coaching, that can be challenging because people might come to coaching not actually being fully aware of the trauma that's present or has happened in their life. So they might have a traumatic experience that is living in their bodies, has left an imprint in their bodies, but they're actually not fully aware of that. And it's certainly not what they're bringing to coaching. That's not what they want to work with, but it is still part of who they are. And suddenly we work in an arts-based way, and we're very quickly tapping into something we didn't even know was there. So again, that's why the capacity to hold these processes is really, really important, and to get the right training and also experience under your belt to be comfortable and to trust yourself.
Yeah, and I think from the festival, one of the first pieces of advice was to actually go and get some art-based coaching yourself to discover the impact for yourself, and then decide if you think that's right for you or not from that perspective. So let's just link that. You've mentioned, obviously, you're a trauma-informed coach. Firstly, let's define a bit what trauma is, and then explain what you mean by trauma-informed coach.
Trauma is, and there are lots and lots of definitions. So in my own word, trauma is the imprint or what's left in the body after either a traumatic event or a longer traumatic experience. So there are obviously sort of the shock and event traumas, which might be a car accident, but then there's also trauma that might have occurred over a really long period. And if we looked at every single event in isolation, it might seem small enough or manageable enough, but in accumulation, all these events chained together have left an imprint in the body, an imprint on that person, and have shaped how they behave and show up in relationships, how they form trust with other people, how they trust themselves, how they experience themselves and how they see themselves in the world, shape their sense of safety, what feels okay, what feels not okay as I move through my day, shape their nervous system. So for me, trauma is really what's reverberating, the echo that is left in the life of that person. And then there are these, I think, helpful concepts around big T trauma, small t trauma, because I think sometimes we feel very clear and very open around what is like big T trauma, which might be a really significant event, but we're really underestimating the impact it has on us when we're experiencing these smaller moments that are traumatic, but we're almost sort of skirting over them because we think, oh, well, that wasn't so bad. I think that's really useful talking about these micro traumas that really add up. And then suddenly, when we've baggaged up enough of that, suddenly the wheels come off and things start to fall apart and crumble a bit. So for me, that's what I would capture as trauma and what really echoes in the person's body and life and relationships.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. I guess an example of a small T trauma is when you're consistently throughout your childhood told that maybe you're useless or silly or things like that that build up and cause a belief system in you that you then play out in life, as you say, until you become aware of it and can have some help with it. Yeah. My view is, and this is my view, is that everybody has some kind of trauma to different degrees depending on their life experience. I think even relatively happy childhoods can have little things in them that have affected our self-esteem or those kind of things. So you can say whether you agree or disagree with that. But I think as a coach, it's not something you can avoid. And I know when I interviewed Kate Brassington for the mental health series, I asked if she thought all coaches should be trauma informed. And she said yes. And I wondered what your view was on that.
Well, firstly, I agree with you that everyone has trauma in their life. Then there's the question, to what extent is there awareness of that trauma? To what extent has this been processed? Because a really difficult experience can lead to trauma in one person, but not to living with the consequences of trauma in another person. And we know from research that a lot is down to the fact whether you've had access to loved ones, to people who supported you unconditionally, who you could trust, and whether these people were available to you right in or shortly after the experience, or whether you felt left alone, isolated, or possibly silenced during or after that traumatic experience. That there is always the experience, but then what is left of it? So yeah, I think everyone has a degree of trauma in their lives, and therefore, going back to Kate Brassington, it would be very good if everyone was trauma informed and really curious and open around educating themselves and also looking inside and into their own lives with curiosity, and not with making that a problem, certainly not with shame, but with curiosity in terms of what are the areas in my life where I've experienced something that was really tricky? How did I cope? How did I not cope? What's still hanging around from that? What's still slushing around in me? And how does that show up and sometimes get in the way?
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a really good way. Curiosity and compassion as well.
Yeah.
Especially if you've been abandoned in your trauma, to then be harsh with yourself is going to just compound on it, isn't it? So you do need to have a lot of compassion. It's something that I'm very passionate about as well. So it's really good to talk about that today. So with your based trauma-informed practice, what does your typical day or week look like?
As much as there is a typical day or week, it's always a mix. So I work, as I said, one-on-one, run workshops and run group programs. So a typical day or week is a mix of those, which then also means there is an element of creating these workshops or group programs. So really creating experiential processes with longer term programs, create some sort of curriculum. What is the content? How are we going to navigate through that? So one of the things I do in my discovery call and contracting is that I speak quite specifically to the trauma-informed aspect of my work. And I do that so that it's really clear to the client that something traumatic showing up in the coaching is okay, that that's actually a safe space. And sometimes when I'm stating that so clearly, I'm not necessarily saying that to the adults in the room, but it's almost like a message to a younger part in that person that it is actually okay to come out in that space, which might sound a bit woo-woo for some people, but I think it's a really important aspect. Another aspect of that is also that I state quite clearly that I'm getting supervision, so that the client, but also all the parts of the client, know that they don't need to take care of me. If something big comes up in coaching, that I've got a space in my supervision, in my clinical supervision, where I can take that and make sense of it, and that no part of the client needs to be responsible or look after my well-being. Because a lot of what we do in trauma-informed coaching, in any coaching, is that we enact attachment patterns. So if I work with a client who's grown up as someone who needed to take care of adults from a young age, that could get activated if they bring something up that's big and heavy and they suddenly worry, oh, do I now need to take care of Conny? So I'm saying you don't need to do that. I always have supervision as a space where I can take that. So there are two really important, deliberate and very overt points I'm making when I'm contracting with clients. One-on-one coaching always involves an element of preparation and also an element of reflection afterwards. So a big cornerstone of my coaching is that I provide quite detailed coaching notes to clients who I really take down and document a lot of their own language that they have used in sessions. And again, I do that because when we work on deep stuff, we also know that our memory isn't always working optimally. So sometimes we simply forget what we said. And it's really good to have an account in terms of how we spoke about experience, how we described our experience, how we spoke about artwork, if that's part of the session. And I think that's where really good coaching notes can be supportive for clients to have that record. And I also believe in helping clients to build a reflective practice. And the coaching notes are sort of a starting point of that, to really build their own reflective practice in terms of what's happening in my life, how am I responding, what alternatives, possibilities can I see? Because that reflective practice is then something that they can take forward into life once the coaching ends. There is a lot of just the businessy side of things. So the administration, the finances, the marketing, the platforms, the website, the social media, so all of that. But of course, the energy is in connecting with people. That is really where the energy is and where I experience the greatest meaning of my work.
So that's what you love about it. That's what motivates you to coach. I'm asking this a bit off the top of the head, so if you can't answer this, Conny, it's okay. But is there one or two moments that you particularly remember that were a highlight for you as a coach that you saw with clients, if you can keep it anonymous?
There are some moments, and they're always somehow relating to sort of big shifts in a way, or people spotting big patterns or how these patterns connect. But I think working with a client, for example, it wasn't the reason why that client came to coaching. And that happens quite often, that they come with quite a clear goal that seems quite clear. But then when we start to work, we go somewhere else. But the pattern that happened was one of intense activation, energy, and having to sort out situations for people. And just being able to recognize that pattern, which has, of course, happened all the time, but the client had never seen it as such a standalone and repeating pattern. That was an important moment because suddenly we could work with something, and we could work with that pattern from a nervous system and regulation or dysregulation perspective. We could work with that pattern historically, looking in the past and getting a sense where that pattern maybe came from or where it showed up the first time. We could work with that pattern in the present in terms of where is it showing up today, in which contexts, personal life, work life, because these patterns, they pop up everywhere. They repeat themselves everywhere, but it's only when we can actually name it and we can say, oh, there it is again, here it shows up. And suddenly it shifted from I'm this activated person to, oh, here's this activated pattern. So it's an externalizing of that, which is a lot more helpful when you try to work with it, because again, it removes the shame. It's a much more compassionate approach, saying, oh, this is showing up for me again. How can I be with that? Rather than, oh, I'm this chaotic or activated person and I'm always responding in that way. Then I'm stuck in these stories and in these spirals that don't give me a way out. And I think I'll be stuck in this forever. That's just who I am. So I think when a client can name their pattern and almost give it a headline, that's always a good moment for me, where I feel there is potential to shift now.
Yeah, that's a good point. Often people come in labeling themselves as a certain type of person. Oh, I'm this or I'm that, or I'm a perfectionist. But actually, like you, when you look into where that came from, because we're not born with some of those belief systems, are we? Especially the limiting ones. We're not born with that. So it is a powerful moment for someone to recognize it's not a deficiency in them, maybe a learned behavior or from some experience. So that's a lovely example. What are your biggest challenges, either as a coach or as a business owner, or both?
Or both. There are challenges in both areas. So as a business owner, I think what I love about the work is also what's a challenge. It's incredibly self-directed. I'm working largely on my own. And whilst I love that and the freedom of that and the flexibility, that's also the challenge, because I need to show up for myself every single day. I need to come up with new ideas all the time. So it's two sides of the same coin in a way. And in coaching, I think one of the hardest things to work with. And it just came up in my supervision yesterday, funny enough, but it's always stuckness. That's a topic that shows up for so many people, including for myself. And that's a really tricky topic to work with, and to work with in a way that we can achieve some lasting change and not just temporary shifts.
Yeah, that is a big one. I'm guessing it's based in fear, any stuckness we have of some sort, but it's not always easy to unravel the reason. It can be more complex, or it can be something from way back. Most of us have experienced stuckness at some point, haven't we?
I think so, yeah. And it's always sort of which part of us is stuck here, and not just approaching that stuckness intellectually and as a concept that's quite easy to talk about it. Oh, just do that and you'll move forward. But there might be parts of us that are still stuck in something, that are fearful of something, that are trying to manage a certain situation. And it's about getting those parts on board so that the whole system can move forward decisively and feeling complete and whole and acknowledged.
And I guess that's where good coaching questions come in. And sometimes it can take time. It's not necessarily something you can sort out in one session sometimes with some people. But that's one of the art of coaching questions, isn't it? Helping people examine. And I guess for you in supervision, where you're getting supervised and coached as well. Just looking at your own stuckness, is it helping you with helping other people with their stuckness?
I think it is, because if I look at my own stuckness and I acknowledge the parts of me that are stuck and why they might be stuck, it always just opens up the curiosity when I work with the clients. Well, which part of that client, which parts are stuck for them? And I think that's a curiosity and an openness to just really embrace that we all bring so many different parts to the table, and that we often don't necessarily see the part that is stuck in the coaching session, if that makes sense. But that part might be hidden somewhere on the back seat, but it's actually the one that's digging the heels in. And that's harder to talk about sometimes.
Yes, it might be the elephant in the room sort of thing that you don't see straight away. It's probably one of the most common things that comes up in a coaching session in some form or another, even if it's not called that initially. So it's a good thing to recognise in yourself as well. Obviously, when we're looking after clients and giving a lot of ourselves, we need to take care of ourselves. How do you take care of yourself, Conny?
Yeah, so there are the basics. I'm like a big believer in good sleep hygiene and sort of going to bed at the same time and feeding my body with the things that feel good and moving my body. I'm incredibly lucky living near a wonderful forest, so I can be out in nature frequently and easily. Then there's also my own creative practice. So I've learned quite early on that if I'm creative day to day, I'm also more creative in my work. So I think that they really go hand in hand. That's where good self-care shows up in better work for and with other people. My own reflective practice, my supervision is a cornerstone of my self-care. And I've got two strands of supervision. One is coaching supervision, and one is that I still work with my clinical supervisor, who's an art psychotherapist. So I still have kept that type of supervision alive and active in my practice because of the trauma-informed perspective that I bring to the work. There is a lot of reading for me. That's, I think, also self-care. I'm wired in the way that through learning and through reading, I can switch off, but I can also absorb new knowledge and new concepts that really help me in my work. I'm just finding that if that all really flows, if I've got a real good connection between what feeds my soul and what inspires me, and I can then bring that into my coaching work, that this just runs really smoothly, and I've got not quite less need for self-care, because you always need self-care, but self-care isn't work or something I need to do. It just becomes such an automatic and generative process for me.
Yes, I guess it's forming those healthy habits that then just become automatic. Just listening to you, what you've talked about, the art-based coaching and the trauma and the way you work and the accountability that you give yourself in the way you work. And it's a little bit of a controversial question in a way, but do you feel that maybe coaching needs to be regulated because we're starting to get a bit more deeper with the way we're coaching?
I think it would be helpful, yes. And here in Australia, also art therapy is a self-regulated profession. So that's quite different to how it is in the UK, for example. So I'm coming, even as an art therapist, out of a self-regulated profession into now a sort of self-unregulated profession. I think it would be useful. I mean, I know a lot of coaches who have the highest standards for their work in terms of their coaching qualification, their ongoing professional development, the supervision they're seeking. But I think especially as there are so many different courses one can take to become a coach, and there are so many different types of coaches and so many different versions of coaching, it's really a bit of a sort of wild field in some ways. And I think more regulation would probably help us to ensure that the majority of coaches deliver excellent work and work to a high standard and in compliance with an ethical code of conduct. And I think that would be useful for the people we want to work with, that it's just not so difficult and not so risky for someone to find a coach and to make sure, is this not just the right coach for me, where the chemistry is right and where it feels like a good fit, but also coach where I can trust, where I can bring these topics and I know they're being held safely and in skillful hands and compassionately.
Yeah, I think that's one of the main pieces of it as well, isn't it? It's about the client's safety, psychological safety, and the client's care as well of regulation. So yeah, it's a bit of a debate going on at the moment, that one. And I think we're having a live webinar to discuss it at the Association for Coaching. So an interesting one to see the different perspectives on that. But, you know, I've met a number of people who call themselves a coach that have no formal training. And depending on their life experience, maybe it's quite a risky place to be with people.
Yeah, I think it can be quite tempting for people to have a certain lived experience and then they bring that to coaching and they almost make their coaching about their own lived experience because they say, well, I know about that, I've experienced that, and that's fair enough. But then there are all these other ethical considerations and these sort of layers in terms of self-disclosure. How much of my own lived experience do I bring into my coaching work, even if I'm coaching in that space and around that experience? So I think, yeah, a bit of regulation would probably help both coaches to have guardrails so they can walk along, and for clients to feel if they hire a coach, if they look for a coach, they can feel certain that the basics are at least there and they're in good hands.
Yeah, thanks, Conny, for your thoughts on that. It gives something for the listeners to think about. Some will disagree and some will agree. Is there anything you'd like to share as any tips or pearls of wisdom for coaches in the profession that you would like to give that might be helpful?
Yeah, so from my experience, I would say the skills around being in relationship, being present, being attuned to the client and to the process are probably always more important than any skills around a particular coaching framework or coaching tools. So I would really encourage coaches to spend time to hone those relational skills. And part of that is also to really know themselves well in relationships, so how they show up in relationships and what does being regulated in a relationship mean for me, and also establish that really outright with the client. What does it look and feel like for you to be well regulated? Because that looks different for each person. And I need to get a sense, if I'm working with clients, where they are in their window, basically. Also, what I found a real profound shift for me was letting go of my own agenda. And I think coming into these helping professions, whether that's as a therapist or a coach, we all like to help. That's why we're here. That's why we feel drawn to the work. But releasing that desire to help or that desire to support someone else in achieving change, releasing that as something that was more my own agenda than actually the client's agenda. And now I'm always trying to show up from a point of creating a space in which the client can get to know themselves differently or better, and where they can get a better understanding of their inner world. If I can achieve that, then I'm already really pleased with my work, rather than must make this client to change something and to create a better life or create bigger opportunities. Letting go of that own agenda was really important. I'd probably say to get real clear on one's scope of practice. And by that, I don't mean so much niching, which is another popular conversation in the coaching space, whether you found your niche, but more your scope of practice. Because I do believe that coaching and therapy lives somewhere on a continuum. And sometimes the transitions can be quite gradual and fleeting in some ways. So really knowing for yourself, what is your scope? At what point would you need to slow down, possibly stop, have a conversation with the client, whether this is still the right format, the right setting to do that work. That's really quite critical. And to be in it for the long game. So I think really understanding that building a coaching practice is not done overnight. It takes a lot of time, energy, and resources, including financial resources, to really build that, and to trust yourself through that long process and not be disheartened too quickly or too easily.
That's some wonderful tips, some really good, solid tips on that. And I love the one you said about letting go of your own agenda. I think, and I can speak for myself here, but a lot of us can come into these helping jobs because, particularly women, we're sometimes brought up to be fixers, rescuers, carers, and that can actually be where we're finding our worth, which isn't necessarily very solid worth because you're relying on external factors. So to get to the point where you can become aware of those things and then step back and just let the process unfold with the client being the main person in the room, as it were, and the client's life and the client's decisions about their life. Yeah, so that's a really lovely thing to say, Conny, I think, and something nobody has said so far on that one. It doesn't mean other coaches don't think that, but it's a very unselfish place and maybe a more genuine place of giving to people.
And what I found through doing that, it took out a lot of pressure. So suddenly there's, what's the next great question I can ask? What's the next great framework I could bring in? What do I think this client needs? All that goes away, actually. And that's sitting with the not knowing, and that's sitting with the silent periods becomes a lot easier. And in a way, it was maybe, as you said, sort of maybe selfless or something, but also it's really good for me to work like that. It's really been quite a shift in my practice to just let go and trust the client, trust the process, and focus just on understanding inner world. That's my beacon.
That's a lovely way to end, just thinking about trusting yourself and trusting the process and trusting what's inside the client too. So that's a lovely way to end. Thank you so much, Conny. You've got a wealth of experience there and knowledge and understanding that you've shared today. So thank you so much for being a guest.
Thanks, Maxine. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the lovely conversation. It's been a pleasure.
Just to finish as well before we close, where can people reach you if they wanted to make contact with you?
They can find me on my website, so that's sensemakingspace.com. They can sign up to my newsletter on that website. They can find me on LinkedIn as well as Conny Weyrich. So yeah, they can find me on Instagram, which is sort of up and down in terms of my activity. And on Instagram, it's @sensemakingspace. That's the handle.
That's fantastic. We'll put all those details in the show notes. So thank you very much, Conny.
Thanks, Maxine. Bye.
Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organisations and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. Explore our digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, signature programs, member benefits, interviews, podcasts, and a portfolio of live events featuring thought leadership, tools, models, and the latest industry trends to help you develop your coaching expertise.